So thanks everyone for joining. My name is Tom Burke from the Funder Safeguarding Collaborative. Just a bit about me. I'm based here in England and I will do a lot of work around how do we keep people safe. My background has been primarily working with children and young people. And I've been involved in some degree with safeguarding much all my life. From a young age, I was involved as what I would look back at and think of as a bit of a loudmouth teenager who tried to make services for me and others, particularly those who've experienced harm in their lives, better. And so that meant speaking out to social workers and others, how they can improve their work with children and young people. And some 20 years later, I'm still here trying to fly the flag about how we improve our work. And a lot of my career and current work has been around supporting people to be heard and to have a say about how they keep themselves and others safe. I was actually first involved in participatory grant making as some 15, 16-year-old involved in distribution of what was called a Millennium Action Fund, small scale grants, $500 that were given to young people around the world. And I was one of the young decision makers. So this is an issue that I'm really passionate about. I'm really keen to have been able to work with PGMC and FSC on developing. For those of you who don't know, the Funder Safeguarding Collaborative brings together a wide range of different trusts and foundations and those with an interest in philanthropy and supporting social change to be able to collaborate, learn and listen about how they strengthen keeping people safe from harm. So we bring together a really big mix of different funders operating all over the world. And I'm just our representative here in the UK. We have colleagues working across Southeast Asia, East Africa, USA and others. And today's session is really an opportunity for us to be able to learn together and for you to share your experiences, to us to share a little bit about the work we've been doing about keeping people safe in participatory grant making. Feel free at any stage to click reactions, raise hands if you're taking part live. I really would welcome any queries or questions. Please do just kind of be mindful if we're online, if you need to deal with an issue, if you've got some distraction at home, turn your camera off and deal with that. We will be doing some small group work, and at that stage, I'd really encourage you to talk practically about your organisation and your experiences, but do be mindful that some people may not want that information shared more widely, particularly given the nature of this topic. So please feel free to be open, but talk about the theme and the topic more widely, rather than necessarily feeding back or sharing identifiable information, given the nature of today's topic. Today, we're going to be thinking a little bit about how do we manage safeguarding, that concept of keeping people safe in participatory grant making? What are some of the key risks that come about when we're involving people in grant making and ceding power? And what are some of the practical issues that you might need to consider? We'll do some practical case studies and some review of that in practice. But first, to get started, I'd love to know a little bit about who is in the room. So I'm going to put a link into the chat box for a Menti. It's a simple little quiz. It just asks you a little bit about how you're feeling as you enter into today's session. The easiest way for you to take part is for you to be able to click the link in the chat box. If you have a mobile phone to hand, you can use that and scan the QR code. And tell us a little bit about one word to describe how you are entering today. How's your day been? Perhaps you're just waking up and joining. Perhaps it's been a long work day for you. How are you feeling as you enter this space? While you're doing that, I want us to be mindful that this topic about how we keep people safe will affect each of us very differently, and how we're entering today may reflect our own personal experiences of harm, about hesitation about being in space, talking about harm. It may be that we're mindful of others that we love or care for who are experiencing harm. Perhaps in our professional lives, that's mindful. At any stage today, any of this topic is worrying you, you can always message me directly, and we'll stay online after the recording if you've got anything you'd like to debrief. But do bear that in mind as you go through today's session. You're all entering this, and we do mindful of the impact it can have on you. So some of the words that people are using to describe how they're entering this space: curious. People are feeling very productive, intrigued, a bit distracted. Well, hopefully my attention will be with you, and it's been a long day. So try and make this as engaging and interactive as possible. Next up, if you've still got that open, I'd like you to be able to tell me, just click next question. Tell me a bit about yourself. Do any of you have a safeguarding role? Do any of you feel that you are a particular individual with a responsibility for safeguarding? Would you say you're somebody who has got some particular experience? Some people can be the named safeguarding lead. So in some funders and some participatory organizations, they will name an individual as having a responsibility. Some will be on the board of trustees or the management committee, and they champion issues to do with safeguarding. Perhaps that's not your role or your experience. Perhaps this is really new for you. Perhaps you don't have any named specific role for safeguarding. And that's a-okay. That's why we've got this joint session with PGMC. Have a few seconds. Okay, so majority of the people in the room don't have a specific named safeguarding role, but a number of you do have that responsibility. So do bring your experience to bear to the conversation that we're having today. You may not have that role. Perhaps you could tell me a little bit about how you would rate your understanding of these terms. I've already said that I'm from a funder safeguarding collaborative. Today was around safeguarding. To what degree would you say that you have a strong knowledge? You can just move these and tell us a little bit about your experience. Is this new to you? Is it something you've done lots before? Perhaps you've had some training. Perhaps you're feeling supported by your organization. So just tell me a little bit, agree to strongly disagree. What's your experience of safeguarding? This is anonymized, just gives us a little sense of the range of experience in the room. A few more moments to do that. You can see here that of maybe about half the people in the room are taking part in this. There's a real mix of experience and knowledge. People are feeling they're quite experienced, knowledgeable, more than half. But actually, support from the organization is not as much there. What about in participatory grant making? What's been your experience of involvement in participatory grant making? Have you been directly involved previously? Is this something that you've never been involved? Is it something that you've got plans to do, but you'd like to do more of? What's been your background and involvement in participatory grant making? Helen's asked a question about me defining safeguarding. I will come on to that very shortly, I promise. Let's see. All right, so but in the room, what's been your experience? So many of you do have experience in participatory grant making. So that's really great to bring that rich experience with you today. And only some may be involved in that. Now, finally, I'd just love to get a bit of a sense about the organizations that you're involved in. Do you have any contact with any particular groups? And I've selected some here based on the experience of those that we've worked with and looking at some of the organizations. But you can just scale along. So if you work exclusively with particular groups, so if you think, well, actually, they're part of our group, but maybe particularly for involvement in participatory grant making, it's really varied. Of course, there can be overlap. You might work both with young women, young disabled people. You might work with both people who are disabled and facing other forms of rights violations. So you can mix and match here. Tell us a little bit about the groups. So much of when we think about planning and designing effective and engaging participatory grant making, engaging people and keeping them safe, comes into an understanding and awareness of who we're working with. And that can bring different types of risks that need to be managed. Thanks very much. So you can see then, so majority of the group do work with people with a specific need or rights violation they've experienced, and a big youth focus, and many working with women. Although it's only about a smaller number who are working exclusively just with those groups. Thanks very much for sharing that. It's just really great to be able to get a sense of that as we contextualize the conversation that we'll be having today and who's with us. So I wanted to share a little bit about our new guide to safeguarding and participatory grant making, and perhaps in response to the query or question that Helen raised, what do we even mean by safeguarding? Well, our guide tries to explain those key terms of safeguarding and participatory grant making to a really broad audience. So we're trying to get people with expertise around keeping people safe and people with expertise in participatory grant making to come together to share learning and to be able to embed that at every stage of their process. We developed this guide by reviewing some of the current resources that were being used. We asked members from our experience in safeguarding and those in the participatory grant making community and others to be able to share what they felt worked. We did a short survey. We talked to those who were involved in leading participatory grant making. So we did a series of short interviews. We did some focus groups talking to people about how they understand the ways to keep people safe. And then our team, who work with nearly 60 different funders and trusts from very different sizes, geographic remits, types of groups, pulled our experience, and we pulled that together into one concise guide all about safeguarding and participatory grant making. That process took about 8-9 months, and I'm really grateful for PGMC for supporting us to be able to speak to people in their networks within that. So when do we think about safeguarding? What does that term mean? Well, there is no one universal definition. Across the world, different people use this term in different ways, and there can be different definitions in different legal jurisdictions, but also across the life course. So there may be different terminology that is used with children and with adults. Generally speaking, perhaps the most popular concept that's been used is some of the regulators. So the Charity Commission in England and Wales, they've been using a definition which is about the ways in which an organisation with a charitable purpose must take reasonable steps to protect people who come into contact with their work from abuse or mistreatment of any kind. So our focus here is about how do we make sure that everybody involved in participatory grant making does not experience any form of abuse or mistreatment of any kind. It's about how do we proactively prevent harm and ensure that we identify people who may be experiencing abuse, maltreatment, harm, neglect, and then ensuring that those with duties to keep them safe fulfill those responsibilities. It's important to recognize that these terms are contested. They vary across the world, that there may be different types of terminology that are used in your country, in your sector, but broadly what unites them is this idea about organizations taking a duty of care to ensure that people are not harmed when they're involved in their activities and that they support people who may be experiencing harm. Likewise, it's important to recognize that this is focused on the reasonable steps. When we think about safeguarding the types of organizations that might be involved in our work around participatory grant making, they can vary significantly in size, in scale, and the types of groups. So what does it mean to be able to keep people safe? It needs to be contextualized to your size and your scale. There won't be a one size fits all about doing what is reasonable given the types of activities you deliver and the risk that you manage. And that will hopefully become clear as we go forward. That links to what do we even mean by participatory grant making? Again, there is no one definition. I know that there's been lots of information out there and on the PGMC website. Perhaps the most popular concept of definition is about the way in which it is process of ceding decision-making power about funding to the communities that funders aim to serve. The concept has been growing over many, many years around how so many funders can be quite closed and insular. And actually, if we are thinking about the ways in which the power that they hold can be quite closed, can be opened up, and ensuring that it's seeded down and opened and unlocked to a wider range of people, ensuring that more people who are directly affected by the decisions of funders get a say in the ways in which the funding is used, distributed. There'll be many, many different models about how that process will work. For us, we've tried to think about this in two types of categories of people who may be involved in participatory grant making. What we defined as team members would be those people who might be administering a fund or involved in the design and delivery of participatory grant making processes. Some trusts and foundations have got work where they, for example, have hired staff, hired volunteers, or hired consultants whose work it is to create processes that seed power to others and to be able to support others to be involved in decision making. And then we use the term decision makers for those people who are actively involved in any participatory grant making process. I know some people might call them participants, but just for clarity today, I'm going to use the term team members who might be involved in behalf of delivery in the organization, and decision makers for those people who may be recruited or claiming power to be involved in the distribution of funding or involvement in decision making. Now, again, really aware that these are not terms that are necessarily universally used, but just to ensure there's clarity, that's how we have defined that based on the consultations we've done with others in the sector. So what we're trying to do in our work is to be able to think a bit about how are those people protected from any experience of abuse or maltreatment through their involvement in the participatory grant making process. And of course, there's a big variety of what that might mean. When we say the term participatory grant making, who is involved will vary. A minute ago, you shared that some of you work with children and young people, some of you don't. Some of you work with single-sex organizations, some people work with those living in poverty or facing discrimination and disadvantage. The skills and experience of those delivering will vary. That can affect the ways in which they will be building relationships, whether or not they themselves have lived experiences of harm that will affect their experiences and how they engage others. The status of the different roles involved. Some people have a participatory grant-making process where there's a very clear delineation between staff and volunteers, between those team members and decision makers. For others, there may be a real kind of variation in those roles that have changed gradually over time. How long and engaged is the relationship? Some people might be involved as a decision maker as a one-off. They might attend a one-off workshop. Others may be involved in a sustained period of time. The longer that they are involved, the more relationships they may be building, but also therefore the types of risk of exposure to harm through abuse or maltreatment or people with an intent to cause harm may vary. Some participatory grant-making processes are relatively independent of the funder that they are working with. The trust or funder may, for example, say, allocate a pot of money and actually all decision-making is ceded to those people. For others, there's a real interplay between the legal board and those who are actively involved in the decision-making process. And the focus area of the funding can bring different types of areas of risk that need to be considered. If you're funding specifically with children and young people, there may be different types of risk that need to be engaged. Whereas if you know that you specifically do not fund with that group, it may be where you specifically are seeking out those who face discrimination or prejudice in that area, they will have different types of risks. So our focus is about saying, think through your participatory grant-making process, asking yourself a little bit about what is the type of makeup of your process and what kind of risk may that bring about, and therefore what will be reasonable and proportionate for you to be able to put in place to prevent harm from coming about through that process. There's not necessarily an answer of what effective safeguarding looks like in participatory grant making. It's a process of decision making that you will work with collectively with team members and decision makers to be able to decide and identify the types of risks and what works to mitigate those risks in your process, given your size, with those people and the activities you're delivering. That thought about being what's proportionate is really important because of the difference in the size and scale of the trust and foundations and the types of funding that you'll be delivering. You might need to be considering in your jurisdiction whether or not there are any legal or regulatory duties where there are obligations on you to take particular actions to prevent people from being harmed. It might be, depending on the status of the different roles of the people, whether or not they're employees or volunteers or consultants, there are different legal requirements on you. The kind of size and the resources you have and the public expectations, or perhaps the regulator or others' expectations. If you're a small community-based organization, there may be different types of expectations on you from the wider stakeholders you work with compared to an international funder who's working perhaps remotely. When we've looked and spoke to people involved in safeguarding and participatory grant making, they highlighted to us a number of different risks that can come about through the relationships So much participatory grant making is a relational process. And what I mean by that, it's about building opportunities for people to come together to create a relationship that enable that power to be shifted, shared, and people to claim that power. And that can bring within it the particular elements of risk that need to be managed. So we know that sometimes there have been harm that's come about between the delivery team members and decision makers. Sadly, there have been experiences where people who have been sought to recruit to be involved in participatory grant making processes may themselves be harmed intentionally by those who are running that process. There could be situations where people who are involved in participatory grant making processes harm one another. Perhaps there's situations where people shared examples of where they've worked with groups in a community where there's ongoing conflict already. And actually, sometimes that conflict is being brought into the participatory grant making space. Or there's pre-existing relationships that have been harmful that have been brought to the group. In some circumstances, you might be working with people who, due to their need for care and support, are people who can present harm to others. Perhaps they are people who are living with a learning disability that may affect their ability for independent decision-making. Without the right care and support, that could be harmful to others because they have their way to regulate their own behavior. There can be conflict sometimes in trusts and foundations between senior leaders and members of staff. There have been allegations and investigations that have taken place in trusts and foundations about the ways in which those in positions of power have abused that role that they've had and have harmed team members. And that can echo through then in the participatory grant-making process if the frontline delivery staff, those working with those organizations and the community and decision makers, may themselves be experiencing harm from others who are working on behalf of the organization. And more widely, we know there can be issues around links between the wider team members and other members of the public. Some participatory grant-making processes will work with just a team of decision makers to be involved in the program and decision-making. Others will have consultation events and clear links with other community-based organizations. It might be that decision makers go out and interview or run focus groups and engage community members. And that in itself can mean that those decision makers can be at risk of harming others, or they themselves may be experiencing harm. So one of the things you might need to consider is how to map out the relationships that will come through your participatory grant-making process and how that can affect the ways that people can be harmed. When we think through those types of relationships, there are therefore also different types of risks of harm that can come about. Sadly, there are instances that we've been reported to us around intentional forms of abuse. The ways in which people have managed processes where somebody in the team, either a decision maker, perhaps a team member who's employed or working on behalf of a trust or foundation, has intentionally sought to harm others. Situations where someone is intentionally abusing others, they may be kind of purposefully aiming to cause harm to other people. Harm can sometimes come about when we fail to meet the care and support needs of the decision makers that we're engaging or of the team members. If, for example, we were seeking to work with children and young people, have we tailored the fact that they are at their unique life stage of growth and the transition from dependence to independence, and making sure there's appropriate supervision to ensure that the spaces they're engaged in are safe and suitable for them? If we're working with adults who are disabled adults or others who have a need for care and support, have those needs for care and support been truly identified? And are we confident we have the capacity and the capability to meet those types of needs? If we don't, is there a risk that that person may actually be harmed, even if it wasn't intentional, but the lack of appropriate planning, the lack of provision is in and of itself left them at risk of harm? And many participatory grant-making processes are trying to shift the ways in which traditional funding relationships and the areas of funding have neglected certain communities or causes, and are often reaching out to decision makers who have lived experiences of some very tough and difficult things in their lives. By going through a process where they are making decisions about who is allocated funding, that might expose them to materials or others' experiences of harm, which in itself can be traumatizing and perhaps re-traumatizing things that they have previously experienced. Got to consider that whilst the process of ensuring that those people have power over decision making It may also be that their unique life experience that brings them such insight to be able to bring to that decision-making process can also mean that they can be particularly distressed by this content. And if it is not handled with care, it can actually cause them real emotional and psychological distress. So those are the types of broad themes considering. How do we make sure we seed power in a way that's safe? How do we make sure that we think about the different types of relationships in our process, depending on our size and scale, and the ways in which there be different types of risks of harm that come about through that? What I'm going to do now is say, what are the top tips of how you can make sure you're embedding the prevention of harm at every step of your participatory grant making process? Our guide goes into a lot more detail on these steps. So I'm going to take you on a journey from the beginning of a process to the end, but recognizing you'll need to kind of tailor this to your size, your scale, and the type of activities you are doing. It's important that if you are from a trust or foundation, that you consider how your basics of safeguarding are in place before you engage in any participatory grant making. In many jurisdictions, there are minimum legal requirements from charitable organizations and nonprofits to ensure that they have a system or arrangements in place to make sure they do no harm to people through their activities. That might mean including making sure the staff working on your behalf are safe, that you have appropriate policies and a procedure of how you would manage any worries if somebody was at risk of harm. Those foundational basics are key to ensuring that you're in a culture of an organization that is thoughtful about the risks of harm and is safe enough to be able to embark on a participatory grant-making process. When we start thinking about designing a new process of participatory grant-making, we'll often go through a phase of iterating ideas and planning, a process where we might start to think a little bit about what type of area of focus. That really does need some consideration about, is there any inherent risks in our participatory grant making because of who we're seeking to fund and how we might be engaging with them? The guide gives tips around how you can recruit those decision makers in a way that keeps them and others safe from harm. It gives advice about how you can design a decision maker role with them in a way that actually enables you to consider the potential risks of harm that comes about from that role and about who is safe and suitable to do that role. How do you make sure the right mix of people who are advertised and encouraged to apply are the right types of people who would not have an intent to cause harm to others involved in the process? Or if they do have a history of causing harm to others, is there a way that that risk of harm can be best managed and mitigated? It's not about excluding people. It's about being clear about the ways in which you would be able to manage the risk that might come about and feel confident that you are still able to run a safe process. We try to avoid there being a stark line that says these people can or cannot participate because they have a history in their lives. It should be more risk-led. There are certain people where you may not be able to manage that risk, and you need to be open and transparent about those decisions, or you need to invest in making sure you've got the right mitigations in place to ensure that they are not able to cause harm through your process. We give top tips about how you can induct and train decision makers about how they can keep themselves and others safe in their role. Now, fundamentally, it's not our responsibility to ensure we're not exposed to issues of harm. You know, we need to, as we're inviting people, we're recruiting people, we need to make sure that we design processes that really meet their needs and are safe. But we can give people the skills to be able to identify if harm does take place, to be able to know how to report that, to know how they can challenge inappropriate behavior from others, and also to make sure that everybody is clear about the expectations and the types of behaviors that you'd want them to behave in, and to co-design that with you whilst involved in the participatory grant-making process. The feedback we had from Participatory Grant-Making Community members and the Funder Safeguarding Collaborative members included the ways in which the ongoing relationships that you build with decision makers in particular need careful thought. That sometimes as you get to know someone better, as more about their lives become clear to you, there can be issues around how you build a safe and appropriate relationship. A relationship which is kind, joyful, but also one that is respectful and treats everybody with dignity. How do we make sure that there are clear boundaries on the ways in which we behave, and therefore those with an intent to cause harm are not able to perpetrate that harm? How do we make sure that if people are pushing the boundaries of what is appropriate behavior or displaying behaviors that we or others are finding challenging, that we respond well in a trauma-informed way, recognizing that this is not about just excluding people, but about managing that risk and making sure we're meeting their needs whilst also keeping people safe. Many participatory grant-making processes have a fixed timeline. They're a fixed-term project. They've got a particular route of process, a route to success over a particular time period. And that can mean that there needs to be clarity about how that relationship with decision-making and team members is ending. There can be real risks if people are left at the end of a process hanging without closure for them because of the types of issues that they've been reflecting upon. But also there's potential risks of the ways in which they might have what we call like a halo effect, kind of a cloak of credibility is given to them if they are involved in a participatory grant-making process and a status in the community. And if they are still seen to be under your code of conduct or acting on your behalf, would that create opportunities for them to cause harm to others by manipulating the opportunity and the status that they've been given? How do we make sure that we learn from everybody who's involved in the participatory grant-making process about how safe they did feel and what more could be done if we were to repeat this process with others in the future? Much of that journey has been all about how we are able to support people from recruitment through to closing the process. But it was also clear that we wanted to make sure that any potential decision makers could also ask themselves and the funders or trusts who are trying to involve them some key questions about what are they doing? How's the accountability from decision makers to funders? As part of our guide, we've issued a list of suggested questions that potential decision makers or current decision makers can use to ask funders. How safe are you keeping me if you want me involved in this participatory grant-making process? It is not saying that these are things that any decision maker must ask. It's a top tips guide that they can choose to ask, so they've got a reasonable understanding of what the organization is doing to keep them safe. We hope that's a tool that really aids positive discussions between decision makers and team members. So often, trusts and foundations can be in a situation where they've got a vision of how they want to live and they go out and recruit decision makers. We want to make sure that decision makers are in control of their own safety and able to ask and hold funders and trusts to account for the ways in which they are currently kept safe, or what more the trust and foundation could do to keep them safe in that process. Safeguarding is ultimately something that we do together. It's something done with people, not to them. So we need to ensure there are tools and opportunities for those involved in this process so they can keep themselves safe and hold to account those with those duties of care to them. That's a bit of an overview of our guide. It is available online. So I've given you a bit of a kind of headline of some of the kind of themes that are involved. If you would like to be able to get yourself a copy, we'll make sure it's sent out afterwards. But if you're watching online, you can just go to the Global Fund for Children's website. We've got Funder Safeguarding Collaborative. Scroll down, and there it is. We'll find it. Publication, Safeguarding and Participatory Grant Making, opens up in a nice new window. And you've got here a PDF guide that you can then access, lots of guidance and information, currently just in English, but if there's demand, let us know. And it goes through some of those key terms, it goes through some of the basics, and lots more information about some of the themes that I've been discovering for you to be able to explore in your own time. Let me just pause there and be able to open up to anybody who's got any queries or questions about those themes of safeguarding participatory grant making. If anything I said was unclear, if I was speaking too fast, if there was any terminology I used you'd like me to clarify. I'll also look through the chat box, see if there's any questions. If you've got a question, you can click reactions, raise hands, and lets me know if there's any other queries or questions. Michael has asked in the chat box, about whether or not there are any networks involved in collaboration for social impact organizations. Certainly on the, throughout the process of designing this participatory grant making guide on safeguarding, One of the things that was really important for us was to see the collaboration that is taking place between different trusts and foundations. And so I think there are growing networks like PGMC, like FSC, who are trying to connect organizations. When we think about that in terms of safeguarding, if you are involved in a participatory grant making process with another organization, one of the things you might need to be considering is who has responsibility for safeguarding in this relationship? Who are the people who actually, between us, have clarity about if we're both collaborating around participatory grant making between two or more organizations? Where does responsibility for safeguarding sit between us? How do we make sure that we always kind of meet those duties and there's clarity so that we don't end up at a situation in that collaboration where organization A thinks that organization B are dealing with safeguarding and organization B think that organization A are dealing with safeguarding. And in reality, nobody is dealing with the prevention of harm and it's just falling through the cracks. You all think someone else will deal with this. So plan ahead in advance in any collaboration, make sure there's clarity about who's responsible for safeguarding in those arrangements, who's asking those questions around types of risks of harm and deciding around that. So I'd like to open up a little bit and hear a little bit about if anybody here would like to tell us a little bit about some of the ways in which they currently are managing risks of harm in their participatory grant making. Some of you said that you do have a safeguarding background. Has anyone got anything they'd like to share around what are they currently doing in their participatory grant making around keeping people safe? Is there anything that I said that struck a chord with you? What type of things are you currently doing to be able to help people stay safe in your participatory grant making? Would anyone like to share an example? Anything come to mind? Diana, yes, I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Please come off mute. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your organization.
I am currently working as an independent consultant, but I was the founding executive director of the Disability Rights Fund. And we had a very thorough safeguarding conversation as well as practices that we developed over time. One thing I don't see in your guide that I have a question about is the grantees actually of participatory grant makers, because that's something that we had to deal with quite a bit, was to ensure that our grantees also understood safeguarding, what safeguarding is about, practices, that they had systems in place. And we also had to do some investigations, in fact, regarding complaints that reached us about safeguarding issues occurring within grantee organizations. So I'm wondering if there, is like a second version of this guide that that will move to that next step of how you handle safeguarding within your community of grantees as a participatory grant maker.
Yeah, a really great point, Dana. So I think maybe when we were doing the consultations around people's views and experiences in this space, one of the things that came up was around that. And actually, it was mainly around the ways in which the basics, what we described in this guide around kind of getting the basics right, including any grant making process that you already have in the relationship with onward grantees, following the decision making by the decision makers from those people actively involved. So some of that, there is guidance in this guide around the ways in which you should be making sure there is appropriate due diligence of the people that you're working with, and the ways in which you might involve your decision, that people who are involved in decision making might be involved in that due diligence process and the particular risks of that. But it is fair to say that this guide's focus is primarily around the decision making process that they go through, rather than the onward management of the grant going forward. There are particular elements in the section all around supporting ongoing relationships with your decision makers and with others who are involved, about any contact they may have with grantees and the ways in which they might be involved in monitoring trips, they may be involved. But we tend to signpost to other types of resources that us at FSC and others have produced around building relationships with grantees, managing any onward reporting backwards. But I think it's a really important point. And actually, I was going to say at the end today, one of the areas that we want to do is really say that this guide is a bit of a start of a conversation, and would love to continue to learn about any particular issues that can come about through the grant making process with participatory processes in the grant management cycle. So totally hear and agree. We kind of signpost at the moment to other resources on that, but I would love to hear any experiences in the conversation about what the particular dynamic of relationships with grantees that can pose risks of harm because the process is participatory in the decision making. I don't know if you want to come back or say anything else on that.
Well, sort of a different topic, and I appreciate that this is just the beginning of a conversation because it has so many stages to think about. But the other thing that we had to really consider, and I didn't really see that called out, although I didn't look thoroughly through the guide yet, is when staff or decision makers are triggered by what is occurring through what they hear may be occurring through due diligence processes within the grantee community, and how you handle making sure that people who get triggered have ways that they can signal that they know they don't want to be part of handling particular issues, and don't have to make that public. So that's another really important conversation to have, I think, is figuring out how people can step out when they need to, and where they don't have to explain why they're stepping out.
Yeah. Really important point, and thanks for sharing about the practice that you've been involved in with digital rights fund previously on that. I absolutely agree with that ethos, and certainly one of the elements that we try to draw out is the ways in which people are able to report concerns that they might be having through the process in a way that is right for them, and actually working with them in the initial kind of engagement phase to be able to design that in a way that is relevant to them, through issues of confidentiality, of how they can share perhaps with others if they feel it is suitable to be able to do so. Some people may think that's very important to do, or to be able to share it individually and directly. But I think it's a really important point to highlight that there certainly has been, I mentioned earlier, around those issues of trauma and distress because of the thematic issues that the people are engaging with. My personal experience with some trust and foundation decision makers, and partly from this process, but more widely, and again, perhaps if others, we'll move on to some group work in a moment, might want to explore this, is that sometimes there can be real balancing acts between the cautiousness of the trust and funder, sometimes to be worried about, oh, this is controversial issues, or these are really tough, so we need to protect people from being involved because they can't deal with this, you know, and it's a very paternalistic view to some people may express. And then on the other hand, wanting to make sure that there is a real awareness of the ways in which things can be re-traumatizing and the types of complexity of trauma that can come about that sometimes is difficult to plan for and have to be responded to because we don't know people's backgrounds perhaps as well, or the kind of level of oppression that people have experienced at a societal or community level can really come to the surface through a process of sharing power, because it becomes live in the room. And I think that that balance is one where I think practice is still evolving between challenging some of the paternalistic views that can exclude people from decision-making, but also making sure that we're not rushing ahead with a process that hasn't been well thought through, and then actually, even if we have a positive intent, can actually leave people feeling quite burnt out and really distressed by the end. I've seen different practices, and I'm not sure we've got an evidence base about how that balance can be best struck, from what I'm aware of. But again, I think that is something where if others have any views, perhaps to share in some of the group work. Okay. Thanks very much for sharing those observations, Anna, really interesting. Does anybody else have any other queries or questions about the guide, about how we produce this, about any of the content? No. In which case, what we're going to suggest is that some of that can sound somewhat theoretical, and it might be a little bit like, oh, well, there's this guide and it's been based on people's views and they've tried their best to gather evidence. But in reality, this is about how we can plan processes that work for people, that actually does ensure that no one experiences abuse or maltreatment. And there are practical arrangements that we can put in place. What I'm going to do is trying to make this a bit more participatory and not just myself sharing the experiences from a wide range of people who FSC and PGMC work together with on the development of this guide, and instead ask you to be able to think a little bit about what types of issues of harm could come about. What we've done is we've gathered together a series of little vignettes of case studies, and I'd like you to be able to act like a newspaper columnist, to be able to consider what help or advice you would give to these types of situations of harm. What I'm going to do is invite you to join some small group discussions, and in those small groups, you'll be placed with a scenario that talks about a practical safeguarding challenge that has come about in participatory grant making. What I'd then like you to be able to do is to be able to consider, based on today's conversation, but importantly, also based on your own previous experience, your knowledge, your skills, what do you think might be the next best step in this situation? What are some of the ways in which any issues of harm could be better prevented by a better or different way of managing that situation? And you can leave notes for us to be able to share. So I'm going to demonstrate how you can take part in this before we go into some small groups. So we'll use a process called a Jamboard, and that is something that allows us all to be able to share views collaboratively together. You'll see when you get this link that on the left, you have a small little vignette of a case study. These are based on acorns of truth from different organizations, but we've tried to change the details to protect confidentiality in those who shared information. I'd like you in your small group or pair to be able to consider that a situation, and then for you to be able to think, what do you think might be the best type of step in that situation? And is there any way that this harm could have been prevented? You'll see that on the left-hand side, you've got an option here to leave a sticky note. So you're just able to click that. Anybody in your group will be able to do so. And you can start to type down your idea. You then click save, click cancel, and then you can click drag and drop. So just to show you that again, click fourth button down. You can write down any ideas, click save, cancel, and then you can able to click, drag and drop and move around. To be able to give you the opportunity to meet other people, we'll put you into small groups, and depending on the group that you are in, you need to, I'd ask you to be able to go to the frame that is relevant to the group number that you are allocated. So if you're in breakout group 1, you're on group number 1. But if you're in breakout group 2, you'll see in the middle here, it says next frame, click that, and it's group 2. It asks you to do that. Group number 3, or group number 4, group number 5. So all of these are small group discussions, an opportunity for you to work together. Suggest that perhaps you take 12 to 15 minutes to be able to consider the vignette. Any observations you have on it, feel free to read some of the others. An opportunity for you to be able to give your thoughts and feedback. We'll then come back in plenary and a chance for you to be able to discuss those in the round and think about that in practice. I'm going to put that link into the chat box. Does anyone have any queries or questions about the technology, about the task, about the way you can get involved in the small group? Feel free to come off mute and let me know. So I'll put the link to that Jamboard now, and we'll start to go into some small breakout rooms. small groups, and maybe just 3 and 4 for you to be able to take part in. All the notes will be anonymous. And if at any stage you get stuck, you've got a little button that says ask for help. Click that, and it will let us know that you've got a query or question. I'll put you into 4 small groups, but if you do want to have a look at any of the others, you can just scroll between as well. Those breakout rooms are opening now. You should be invited to join a breakout room. Welcome back. I hope that that activity gave you a chance to be able to speak with others, to be able to meet, say hello, to be able to think about what practical arrangements might come about through when we're managing issues of safeguarding and participatory grant making. Got about 10 minutes or so for us just to be able to open up and to be able to share any feedback or queries, observations or thoughts from that activity. If you'd like to do so, there's no pressure, but I'd encourage you to kind of step forward and say if you'd like to share anything that came up in your conversation. Perhaps you had a case study you found particularly interesting, raised a new dynamic for you, or you'd like to share a little bit about what you thought the right next steps might be. I'll share my screen with that kind of case study back. Just to give a bit of an overview and then invite you to share anything. Well, would anyone like to step forward first and to be able to share their perspectives? Did any conversation go particularly? Anyone like to share? Yes, go ahead. Sheila.
Hi, yeah, thanks for hosting this space. I was in group 4, so we talked about the 4th process in which, as you can pull up here, speaks to a board that is really committed to safeguarding and decolonizing aid, and has developed this process in which they are going to determine who is the right people to be involved in this grant making, participatory grant making process. Ultimately, they came up with a very non-localized option that did not make sense for the context nor effective, and so what we talked about was starting from the beginning. Obviously the best next step is pausing and redoing this process, but preventing in the future, having conversations with community at that first step of identifying with them what are the ways in which community handles situations, how the community would like to ensure that those participating have not caused harm, more community-driven safeguarding. We also just talked about the notion of why is the board involved at this level, and of this operational decision-making, and perhaps interrogating that just a bit. There's other things in there, but those are 2 big ones.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing and concisely summarizing there. Just to say, I think one of the reasons why this came about is that we have seen that sometimes, sadly, people are somehow using, are claiming that it's not possible to do participatory grant making in a safe manner and imposing on communities very stringent, often from non-community, they're placing ideas from one country or context and dropping them into another and saying, you must do it in this way. And actually, rather than taking a risk-led approach and really engaging with people to think about what safety looks like in that context, imposing, which actually is replicating some of the inherent power structures. Yes, there is good practice that can be learned, but as you say, much of this can go back by actually talking to people and really sharing how do we all keep each other safe in that space. So thanks so much for sharing those ideas. Would anyone else like to share some of the case study that they looked at, or some of the thoughts that came about? See that we've got lots of comments on some of the boards. Case study number 3 was looking at the ways in which a youth group were coming together and how they, in their conversations, ended up kind of really with a concern about a young man, about the way in which he was finding a real disparity between some of the experiences that he had in his life. This is a young person who was perhaps living by themselves, and how he was really shocked about giving out a grant for a salary, even though that might be a kind of comparable role, and how that might come across. Some interesting dynamics here about how you facilitate and support people in groups, and the kind of ways in which the power of decision making can bring out some of those issues of distress that was come about. You didn't see case study number 2 was looking at the way in which a family trust was changing and having on their board new people who are really keen for participatory grant making. But there's real hesitation from board members about involving people with criminal record histories in participatory grant making, and how sometimes the intent around participation can sometimes be subverted, where things around safeguarding are used as a tool to exclude rather than a way of managing risk to include. I was really struck here by group number 2. We're talking about preventing this by thinking through what is a strength and a risk, and how actually there's real benefits here about talking about someone's lived experience, bringing insight for decision making, and that asset-based approach I think is really vital for us thinking through about what people can contribute whilst managing risk. Those things are not necessarily opposing ends, they are things that come together, and certainly our approach at FSC and the guide tries to see you to think through about how to best manage risk, rather than using an approach to safeguarding that sometimes excludes, without really exploring the ways in which that may not be necessary or even proportionate, and actually in a sense can be self-defeating, because you're not going to include those people with lived experiences that are so often excluded from this. Group number 1 were exploring about the relationships that can come about from participatory grant making with board members and team members, in particular where people's care and perhaps genuine appreciation for those who are involved in decision making, participatory grant making, can lead to relationships that sometimes might be challenging for the organization to consider if appropriate or not. About the ways in which people might want to be able to consider what is or is not appropriate relations, and how those can be negotiated and agreed collectively, given the different backgrounds and different status of different roles that people have in these processes. Does anyone else have any other queries or questions or observations that came up from their discussion? Anything they'd like to share with the wider group about these themes? In which case, I would just highlight before we come to a natural close that when we're thinking about issues to do with safeguarding, our guide is an introduction. It's really an essential guide. It tries to give a bit of a framework for decision making. We're really open to any feedback, anything you thought could be helpful, and anything that you thought was missing. We've already had some comments here about the way that it could be, for example, continue to evolve and develop. In particular, I would highlight the ways in which there may be emergent practices in your organization that you want to share with others. And Jelena earlier on spoke all about the ways in which you can share practice in different spaces at the PGMC. And certainly you can always contact us, the Funder Safeguarding Collaborative, if you've got any thoughts, comments, areas for improvement for managing safety in your participatory grant making process. Very happy to offer any ad hoc advice, information, and to hear your stories of lessons learned and for change. Just a reminder that if you do want any more information around our work, you can have a look on the Funder Safeguarding Collaborative website. There's lots of information there about our approach, about how you can get involved, and including other publications that may be relevant. There were questions earlier about wider approaches to grant making and the way in which you can manage relationship with grantees. Our framework for foundations and our funder approaches to safeguarding give a real overview about effectively involving people in safety in the relationships with grantees that can be applied in also participatory grant making. But beyond that, if there are no further queries or questions, I just want to say a big thank you very much for taking part today. I will just put a quick little feedback form into the chat box. So if you have got any feedback, do let us know. We always really appreciate you giving your time. We want to make sure it's as valuable as possible. So if you've got just 1 minute, spend a moment, just 2 or 3 quick questions to ask you a little bit about how you found today. Beyond that, a big thank you very much, and all feedback very welcome. Thank you.